Somewhere in Nairobi, a bank account empties. Not because someone broke down a door, not because a teller was held at gunpoint, not because a safe was cracked open in the dead of night. It happened because someone sitting calmly at a laptop typed a few lines of code. And just like that, millions of shillings vanished. No blood, no noise, no witnesses. Just a number on a screen, slowly counting down to 0. Now imagine the person who built this system wasn't just some rogue programmer working from a dark room. Imagine he was a government detective, a man hired specifically to stop people like this. And imagine he was very, very good at his job. This is the story of ForkBombo, the most dangerous cybercrime gang East Africa has ever produced. Between 2013 and 2020, they stole hundreds of millions of shillings. They hacked the judiciary, they robbed the police. They nearly brought down an entire bank in Rwanda. And by the time anyone figured out who they were, they had already vanished back into the noise. So how does a man hired to protect Kenya's financial system become its greatest threat? Let's start from the beginning. The year is 2010. Kenya's Directorate of Criminal Investigations, the DCI, is receiving report after report of companies losing money to hackers. It's a new kind of crime, one that most detectives don't understand. So the DCI does what any institution would do when it's out of its depth. It brings in an expert. His name is Calvin Otieno Ogalo, and on paper, he is exactly what they need. Ogalo understands computers in a way that most of his colleagues simply don't. He speaks the language of the criminals they're chasing. Within 2 years, he has tracked down some of the most talented hackers in the country. People who had broken into systems that everyone assumed were unbreakable. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn. Because Oglo doesn't arrest them. He doesn't bring them in. He doesn't build a case. Instead, he makes them an offer. We don't know exactly what he said in those early meetings. That part of the story lives only in the memories of the men who were there. But we know what happened next. In 2012, Ogalo is let go from the DCI. The official reason has never been made public. And by 2013, he has assembled a crew. Not a gang in the traditional sense. No territory, no colors, no guns. Something far more dangerous. A team of specialists. Men who could move through digital systems the way a ghost moves through walls. They called themselves ForkBombo. When you picture a criminal organization, you probably picture something chaotic, violent, impulsive. ForkBombo was the opposite. By the time investigators began to piece together what this group had been doing, they found something that looked less like a gang and more like a company. There were financiers, there were specialists, there was a clear hierarchy. And at the top always was Ogalo. His key lieutenant was Alex Mutungi Mutuku, described by cybersecurity professionals as one of the finest hackers in Kenya. Then there was Ruben Kiragathi Mwangi, Eric Dixon Njagi, and others brought in quietly, carefully over time. Their methods were sophisticated. In some operations, they gained remote access to a company's financial systems, silent, invisible, precise. In others, they worked with insiders, people already inside the target, who would plant small devices in server rooms, devices that recorded everything: passwords, login credentials, internal communications. The company would have no idea anything was wrong until the money was already gone. And here's the detail that eventually unravels everything. For years, all the stolen data, all the keylogger records, all the captured passwords was funneled to a single Gmail address, forkbombo@gmail.com. It seems almost reckless in hindsight, using one email for everything. But at the time, it worked. And ForkBombo's first major strike came in 2013. They set their sights on the Kenyan judiciary. Through a sophisticated social engineering scheme, they managed to make it appear as though the judiciary itself was requesting a payment from the national treasury. The request was for 80 million Kenyan shillings. It was approved. The money moved into accounts controlled by the gang. And by the time anyone understood what had happened, ForkBombo was already preparing their next move. Between 2013 and 2017, they struck again and again. Banks, companies, government institutions. Experts estimate the total stolen runs well above 400 million shillings. But the true number? Only the gang knows. Every criminal organization has a moment when greed overtakes caution. A moment when the targets get bigger, the risks get higher, and the people you're stealing from stop being abstract and start being people who will come looking for you. For ForkBombo, that moment came in 2017. Their target, the Kenya Police Sacco, a savings cooperative run by and for members of the Kenyan police force. They walked away with 50 million shillings. And in doing so, they made it personal, because many of the detectives now assigned to investigate ForkBombo were members of that very Sacco. This was no longer just a case. This was a robbery that had landed directly in the pockets of the people hunting them. Surveillance intensified, but ForkBombo wasn't done. Their next target was the Kenya Revenue Authority, the tax collection agency that processes billions of shillings in government revenue every year. One operation alone caused losses estimated at nearly 4 billion shillings through a scheme that helped corrupt businessmen import vehicles without paying taxes. And then the Americans arrived. 2 US nationals, Larry Peckham II and Denise Hutron. They flew to Kenya after establishing contact with Ogallo. We don't know exactly what business they expected to conduct. What we know is that they became the thread that investigators pulled on. And when they pulled, the whole operation began to unravel. In March 2017, 10 suspected ForkBombo members were presented before a Kenyan court. And Calvin Otieno Ogallo, the government detective who started all of this, was finally in custody. You'd think that would be the end of the story. The boss is arrested, the crew is in court, the empire is finished. But criminal organizations rarely die when their leader falls. They adapt. While Ogallo awaited trial, his third in command saw a vacuum and moved to fill it. Reuben Kiragothi Mwangi took control, and almost immediately he began rebuilding. New recruits were brought in: Dedan Muchoki Muriuki, Samuel Wachira Nguto, Damaris Nyeri Kamau, Steve Mena Wambugu. And then Mwangi did something bold. He took the gang international. The target, Rwanda, specifically the banking sector of Kigali. At least 4 banks were in their sights. One of them was Equity Bank. In late October 2019, ForkBombo attempted a trial run on Equity's EasyPay system. They wanted to see if the defenses were as strong as they appeared. The attempt failed. But they didn't leave. They stayed. They watched. They planned. And while they planned, they were also recruiting locally, finding vulnerable people, low-income workers, casual laborers, domestic staff, and using them as money mules. These were people who had no idea who they were really working for. They were simply told to withdraw money from specific accounts at specific times and hand it to a specific person. ForkBombo had been so careful to compartmentalize their operation that even the mules didn't know each other. It was, by any measure, a sophisticated criminal network operating across 2 countries. But Rwanda's intelligence services had been watching the whole time. Rwanda is not a country that takes financial crime lightly. Its intelligence infrastructure is widely considered one of the most effective on the continent. And by the time ForkBombo arrived in Kigali, the Rwandan authorities already knew they were coming. Equity Bank's Kigali branch had voluntarily shared information with investigators. The moment they received intelligence that hackers were circling their systems. Back in Nairobi, a cybersecurity firm called OnNet Africa had spent years quietly building a case, sharing intelligence with law enforcement, identifying patterns, connecting ForkBombo to incident after incident through that one consistent detail: the Gmail address. The trap was set. ForkBombo moved into position, confident in a plan they had run dozens of times before. They didn't know that Rwandan intelligence was watching every move. When the moment came, the arrests were swift. 20 people taken into custody, 8 Kenyans, 11 Rwandans, 1 Ugandan, all charged with cybercrime. A Rwandan court handed down the sentences not long after. 8 years in prison, a fine of 6 million Kenyan shillings each. Back in Kenya, the earlier members of the gang, those arrested in 2017, had already faced their own reckoning. Achoka, Bokella, Mwangi, Murithi, convicted in January 2020, 7 years after that first judiciary heist. The empire that Calvin Ogalo built from inside a government office, brick by invisible brick, was finally, completely dismantled. Here's what you just witnessed. A man trained to understand cybercrime built the most sophisticated cybercrime network East Africa had ever seen. He used the government's own knowledge against it. He recruited from the inside, he protected himself with layers of complexity, and for years it worked. In 2016 and 2017 alone, Kenya lost over 17 billion shillings to hackers. Not all of it was ForkBombo, but they lit the fire that burned brightest. And their story forced a reckoning about how Kenya protects its financial institutions, about who it trusts with sensitive information, about how thin the line really is between the hunter and the hunted. ForkBombo is gone now, but the methods they used, the vulnerabilities they exploited, those still exist. And somewhere out there, in a quiet office or a dark apartment or a government building that no one is watching closely enough, someone is taking notes.